What's happening, folks? Geologist Philip Prince. Been a minute here. Going to try to start doing some videos about Helene and its aftermath. I wanted to start out looking at the area that you see here, which is in Buncombe County, North Carolina. You're looking down on the Garren Creek community. It's outside of Fairview, and this area received absolutely devastating impacts from debris flows. And the satellite imagery that I've just opened there in Google Earth, going to try to stay live in Google Earth here just to show how these tools work and to show the change in the landscape here. These debris flows are absolutely catastrophic. This has received news coverage. There is a very significant loss of life associated with these debris flows. They tend to be called mudslides in news stories. That's not what they are. Mud is involved, but so are lots of boulders, trees, and everything else that is in this channel coming down the mountain, and it all gets scraped up and impacts whatever is present where the channel mouth sort of opens out into these flatter areas. The satellite imagery here is from October 7th of this year, so that's a little bit over a week after Helene came through. And if you take it away and look at the 2023 Google Earth imagery of this location, of course, you see no evidence of that scouring of the landscape down these channels that the debris flows produced. What's really bad about this situation, of course, is the number of people that were living at the mouth of the channel that carried the debris flow. There are a lot of houses to be seen here, and there's actually a very small stream flowing between the houses, a tiny little stream, call it a branch in this part of the world. Even at its worst flood with water, this is not a feature that would present any kind of significant hazard, it would seem, to the homes here. But in the case of a debris flow type event, the resolution is poor here, but you can make out the outline of the affected area and get a pretty good sense of just how bad this really was. Being in a place like this, there are countless small communities like this in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Western North Carolina. You could live here for centuries and never see anything like this happen. It also is possible that you could see a couple of events that could produce debris flows like this within just a few years. We have not seen that in this part of Western North Carolina. And in a place like this, where something like this is unexpected, an event that's extreme as Helene comes along, it sets up a very, very bad scenario. The debris flows that happen here are absolutely exceptional, monstrous in their scale for this part of Appalachia. The one that affected this community here that's close to the Garren Creek Fire Station there started right up on top of the Swananoa Mountains. They're about 4,200 feet above sea level. So it'd be let's see, I don't know, what would that be? 1,200 meters, something like that. It came down the mountain, descended about 1,400 feet. So it came down about 14 or about 450 meters, excuse me, in elevation. Scoured everything along the way. The amount of material brought by this was absolutely incredible. And you can see that there are several areas where these flows started. Typically we call these initiation zones, IZs for short. There are three principal IZs associated with the big flow over here. Yeah, one, two, three, possibly four, or even five associated with the flows to the west there. And I know for sure that in this area, after the first failure occurred, we don't know which one of these failed first. It sent a debris flow through. A firefighter responded to a house that had been hit, and then a second debris flow came through, and the firefighter did not make it out of that. So that's a point related to this type of event that's pretty significant to understand. Just because one flow passes through it doesn't mean that the landscape is done, particularly in a rain event as extreme as what came along with Helene. This flow here from top really to bottom down here, it's almost 2 miles long. So it would be a little bit over 3 kilometers in length. And the distance from the top of the mountain where it failed to where it impacted the community here is something like a mile and a half. So it'd be about 2.5 kilometers in length. And this is big by Appalachian scales, just in terms of how the landscape lays out, just the size of the mountains, the relief on the mountains, the slope of the mountains, things like that. Wanted to try to draft out actually in a paint sketch here, sort of what this would look like sequentially, and that's probably the most important part of this video, is understanding first of all where an event like this would travel, what this would affect in the landscape, and also the sequencing that can come along with it, in the sense that if one of these passes through during an event like this, it should be expected that other pulses may come along with it. And I have an idea. I don't know it for sure, but I have an idea that in past debris flow events in Appalachia, you don't need a Helene event to have debris flows here. It probably has occurred that one pulse comes through, people come out, move around, and then a second or a third one comes along. So I'm going to hop out into paint here real quick, and try to sketch this out. And ideally, I don't know if I can do. I'll put in the editor and try to play it again, so you can kind of get a sense of the movement and sequencing there. And what you have to keep in mind, we're looking at this remotely. We're high above it, looking down. In the affected community here closest to the Garren Creek fire station, that's about 450 feet wide. So that would be 130, 140 meters wide. The track here, the scoured area, is 100 feet or so, about 30 meters wide. The physical scale of this is absolutely enormous. And there are some videos on YouTube where you catch a glimpse of what this looks like from the ground, and it's absolutely unbelievable. So try to draft this out, see what I can do with it in the editor, and then we'll hop back here and actually use LiDAR imagery to look at this slope, and get a sense of the type of features on it that failed, and talk about efforts that are in place and have been in place to try to improve the understanding of the hazard here. But it's very challenging in a landscape like the Appalachians, because you don't have these events every single year. Some parts of the world do. We do not. And because of that long time interval, it's difficult to keep it on folks' minds that this is at least a potential event, because you certainly can live your entire life in this part of the world and never see anything like this, right? So hang on just a minute here, and we'll hop out of paint. Okay, so what I'm going to try to draft here is sort of a cutaway, looking into a mountain landscape, kind of like the ridge of the Swannanoa Mountains that rise up behind the Garren Creek area there in Buncombe County. This part of the Appalachians tends to have a little bit more complex topography than the Appalachian Valley and Ridge, which I talk about a lot on this channel. And one of the main reasons for that is that the bedrock here is quite different. This is metamorphic rock. It tends to not form the very long straight ridges that you see in the valley and ridge. You tend to get sort of a more branching topographic pattern, and that means that stream networks that come off the sides of the steep topography may have several small branches that come together and ultimately end up producing larger streams. But as they're coming off the mountain, they can be sort of widely separated and variable in their sizes, but they can, in most cases, be very small, even by the time they get to the bottom of the mountain. And the issue there, like I mentioned earlier, is that they look so small. It's hard to imagine a small stream like that having the potential to do much damage, really, under any circumstance. I'm going to need to make a little bit of a change into my foreground here. I'm going to try to illustrate sort of how topography in this part of the world might control where people are living, and sort of end up almost forcing choices in land use that, for most of the time, they're not going to cause any particular problems, right? So I'm going to have my high topography come all the way out to where we're looking at it here in the foreground, right? So landscape laid out like that. These kind of hollows that I've shaded in here make their way down slope, and typically in a place like this, you're going to see these sort of flat areas of deposited material at the mouths of those drainages, and that's where material carried by debris flows in the past has come down the slope. Now that's in the past. You may not have seen this happen, and for that reason, it does not give you any cause for alarm, particularly in the case of these tiny little stream networks that are coming down the slope, right? So you could live right along one of these and be there your entire life and never see it produce anything like the destructive behavior that we saw in association with this event, right? So I'm going to draft a couple more of these in just to give a sense again of what the landscape looks like here. And when you have such a pleasant setting like this for almost almost all of the time, this part of the world doesn't have bad earthquake problems, doesn't have volcanoes. You don't get tornadoes here, really. The seasonal weather's not too bad. The winters aren't too bad. Typically, tropical systems aren't that big of a problem. This is, in most cases, a pretty safe and secure place in the natural sense to live, with the one exception to that being when you end up with an event like a Helene. And in the case of Helene, the orographic forcing, the driving of the moist air up the slopes like the Shenandoah Mountains was a big part of it, and it concentrates so much water in these small drainages they turn into something that you have sort of never seen before. Again, even if you've been there your whole life, typically you see a development pattern here with houses sort of lining these small streams and sort of spreading out basically anywhere in this landscape that you can get a good flat place to live. It's a nice place to be, right? And if you're not here for 1,000 years or something like that, perhaps you've never seen an event, like this before. So we'll add some dots here to represent where structures might be located in this landscape, and you can probably start to see where the potential danger here is going to arise, right? So in an event like a Helene, going to have a debris flow start way up here as a small landslide. It would not look that significant where it began, but it's going to make its way down this channel and pick up everything along the way. And if you are in its path, it's really not something that can be blocked, stopped by a structure or anything like the amount of mass involved. It's just sort of on the next level. With all these branching hollows and valleys, can have a second pulse come through, and then maybe even a third. And every time, depending on how much material ends up being deposited down there on the flat area, it may follow a slightly different path each time. When saturation is like it was with the Helene event, really you should expect the entire mountainside, really any drainage that has the right amount of steepness should be expected to behave this way, and you should expect to see that kind of sequential behavior where you have one failure like we've illustrated here, and then maybe a minute later, maybe 10 minutes later, maybe 30 minutes later, you can have another failure and even another one, right? So the debris flows are going to follow the topography. They're going to follow the small streams here until they get out sort of onto the slightly flatter land, and then they're going to start to spread a little bit. But the amount of mass is moving, the speed that it's moving with, the energy it carries, it's still going to be extremely damaging, right? Now, what you notice here is some parts of the landscape aren't affected by this. So the structures that I've drawn here, they're sort of right in line with a ridge, right? With the spur of a ridge there. So they're on what's essentially like a convex out portion of the toe of the slope. The water doesn't flow there, and in this case, the debris flows did not go there either. It all depends again on the nature of the drainages and where the hollows and ravines are. But there are absolutely places at the foot of the mountains here that will not be affected by events like this. And then there are other locations that are pretty close by that will see very extreme effects from it, right? So bearing in mind that there can be multiple pulses of this, that these events are always going to follow, in effect, the water courses down the slope, and that even a tiny, tiny, tiny little stream or branch actually has more potential to produce a destructive debris flow than a large stream does, because that tiny stream is coming off of a very, very steep slope, and that steep slope is going to provide the saturated soil on it with a reason to fail to begin with, right? So the small streams that look incapable of producing really destructive flooding are the ones in many cases that you have to look at in terms of being producers of even more extreme and more damaging debris flows, right? So it's a way of looking at topography that, again, you may never have to do. There are probably places in the Appalachians that haven't seen a debris flow, though they could produce one in 1,000 years or something like that. There's other places that see them with some regularity. So understanding this is an important step, and it's very likely that if you live in parts of rugged Appalachia, that your county or even the state can provide you with information about where you may be at risk for experiencing one of these events, right? So hop back to Google Earth now, and I'm going to talk about where these failures started, and what you can think about in terms of reducing the potential hazard that you might experience as a result of an event like this. Okay, so hopefully the illustration sort of provides some context of what you're looking at here. And when you see these various scoured tracks, it's important to remember this didn't all happen at once. So after one comes through, that does not mean that it's safe to go into the affected area down here. And unfortunately, it's a tough choice to make, because there are probably people that need assistance there, and it's not really possible in an event like this to know what's happening upslope and to know if another one's coming, because they travel so fast. You're looking at a mile here. If it's going 30 miles an hour, you're going to have 2 minutes. If it's going 40 miles an hour, of course, you're going to have less. You can do the math there. So it's not a situation in which it's practical to warn people that may be assisting that another one's coming. Places like I'm pointing out here, this is not opened onto, if you will, by the ravine here that carries the channel. So this is essentially a safe place, and it's a safer part of the landscape to be in when you're at the foot of big topography like this. And it's possible, actually, to sort of model where material coming out of this channel will be able to affect. So in terms of living in a landscape like this, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't live anywhere in it where there's a mountain above you. It's not practical to do that, and it's not practical to try to get people to abandon their lives in a place that's very important to them. You just have to be aware of the hazard. Debris flows don't happen in dry weather. They don't happen if it rains an inch or two. They're going to happen with much more extreme rainfall. The threshold in this part of the world is about 5 inches in 24 hours, and of course, we massively, massively exceeded that with Helene, and it was a given that there would be debris flowing associated with the event. You just can't, you can't say exactly where. So thinking about where you are and if you could be affected is important. And being away from there, if you know that type of weather is coming, is another important part of that. So you can't stop the event, but you can reduce the hazard associated with it. As far as first responders are concerned, it's important to remember that if you're there early, you need to expect additional instability after the first one comes through. And again, that's not a good decision to have to make. And there's not really a way. This is covered in clouds. It's raining. It's at night. Something like that. It's simply not possible to know what may be happening. So being able to keep in mind sort of the function of this type of feature is very important in dealing with it. And it's possible to look at, with LiDAR imagery here, what the landscape looks like underneath those trees. And if we go up the slope here and look at where these failures actually started, Yeah, you can see the start of the debris flow here. This would be a series of three or even four just really small little landslides. If we bring the LiDAR imagery in there, that's where it started. Just a particularly steep spot on the slope. From this sort of lumpy appearance of it, it looks like there may have been a smaller landslide here in the past. That material is extremely steep. It's very unstable. It's saturated. That's where the problem begins. And as the flow makes its way down the channel, it's going to collect all of the sediment and debris and trees that are down in here and just add that to the mass going down slope. We can see another initiation zone right here. You can see that scoured area coming down to the channel. And that also has these little divots in it that are fairly consistent with failures that might have happened in the past, but were just not nearly so large, and with less saturation, they didn't have the power to keep going, right? So looking at features like we're looking at now with LiDAR, it's possible to gauge parts of the landscape that could produce debris flows. And because of the way they follow drainages, we can tell where they are likely to go. That does not tell you where they will happen with a storm event, but it shows you areas that can be affected. And that's where the decision making comes in, essentially to not be there when this type of weather and this type of event is a possibility. Now, in terms of the overall Helene event, we'll talk about this more in coming videos. Like, has there ever been anything like this around here? Almost certainly. 1916's event in this part of the world was similar. This one absolutely exceeded it fairly considerably in some locations, but the mountains, suffice it to say, are absolutely covered with scars of debris flows in a lot of places. And I'll show an example of one of those right here. This is up in McDowell County. It'll probably take this a minute to kind of balance out once Google Earth zooms in here. And this is going to be an older debris flow. I think the assumption is that it's probably from the 1916 storm. We don't know that for sure. McDowell was heavily affected by Helene, but this feature and ones like it make it very clear that this is not this is not a one-time event. Right there in the middle of the screen, we'll let everything calm down here just a moment. Sometimes the screen recorder doesn't do too well when Google Earth's moving around a lot. Outlining with the hand right there, the failed area. I'm gonna actually draw that in here real quick on the screen and do it with a yellow line there. So, kind of this scar here in the landscape, right? So that is where a debris flow started. And clear that out now, and we'll make our way down slope and look at where it went. So it came down, followed this channel just like we've been talking about. And even today, not knowing how old this feature is, right down here at the mouth of the channel, you can see what looks like, I don't know, it has almost like kind of a cake batter kind of appearance, right? You have these kind of shapes outlining the boulders and coarse debris that moved with this flow. This would have moved plenty of other material with it. It would have gone much farther than what's outlined right there. But it is, evolving in sort of the same way as a Helene type debris flow would have done. And if you look up here, back towards the top of the mountain, it gives you a sense of where it came from, and it's considerable. It drops a long way, and it has a tremendous amount of energy. So I'll draw it in here real quick one more time, all the way from top kind of down here to bottom, and it would have again, it would have kept going down off the screen. Studying historic features like this gives you a sense of where they go. We know they've happened here. We don't exactly know how far they went, and we also don't know what the water flooding associated with the event that produced this would look like. The landscape here is full of all these little scars and pock marks that are associated with smaller failures that didn't quite turn into big debris flows like that one. But all that to say, the Appalachians in this part of the world are massively scarred with the landslides that were produced by storms comparable to Helene there in the past. So the goal of folks working with understanding these hazards is trying to communicate them to planners, trying to make information available to counties, to states, and ultimately get that in the hands of people. And it's possible to access that information if you know that you should be looking for it. And that's probably the most important point is that could this affect me and should I even think about it? And honestly, it's not on people's minds in a place like this. I walked up on a debris flow yesterday on the north side of the mountains here, not too far from the area that we've been talking about. And you're in kind of a nice place on the north slope there. North slopes tend to be pretty cool in the Appalachians, kind of cove forests. You would just not you wouldn't think about this happening. And it is just a place that you wouldn't consider investigating hazards like these. The small landslides that these start with, try to pop up a little piece of video here that shows what they look like. They can be pretty thin, just maybe a 2 foot thick section of soil over an area 40 or 50 feet across or something like that begins to slide. And it's just that idea that it picking up all that material on the way downhill that ultimately makes it so destructive. So being able to understand how these work is an important part of trying to reduce their impacts. And going forward, there probably will be, increased interest in this. The difficulty again is trying to keep it on people's minds because we may go for 100 years and not see anything like this in this part of Western North Carolina again, or that could not be the case, and simply no one knows. The only thing that you can know is how steep is the mountain, how much rain does it take to get something like this going, and where is it going to go? And that information is there, and hopefully it can become more widely distributed. Right. So I'm gonna try to do a few more Helene videos. I want to talk about the sort of the drivers behind the extreme rainfall, show where rivers go. That's something I haven't seen too much in the news, is actually how this landscape is laid out and how rivers like the Nolichucky, for example, goes to Erwin, Tennessee, where it received so much of the rainfall that caused the flooding because that was very far upstream, actually in the vicinity like of Mount Mitchell, North Carolina. So I'm going to talk about geography and things like that, as well as historic storms here in this part of the Appalachians that had catastrophic effects. The record of that has begun to fade. There are still records of it, but as I said, people just don't really know that they should be looking for it. And because of the climate in this part of the world, it might not be something that we ever see again. And it might not even be something that the next generation sees, but we don't know that. So we have to keep it on our minds. Not a pleasant topic, but the goal here is just to try to tell people what went on and to give it a little bit of context, right? So I hope you check out the next video. Sort of busy these days dealing with some of the effects of this event, but I'll try to keep them coming here.